This is Abe Friedtanzer from Awards Buzz, and I'm very excited to be speaking with David Oyelowo about Lawmen, Bass Reeves. How are you, David?
I'm very well. It's a beautiful day in LA.
I'm glad to hear. Can you tell me what you knew, if anything, about Bass Reeves before starting on this project?
Um, I I knew nothing of Bass Reeves in 2014 when I was first approached with the possibility of playing him. I knew a fair bit about westerns and not least how much I loved them. But in all honesty, I hadn't even really fully appreciated how much I had been robbed of the fact that one in three, as I went on to discover, one in three cowboys were black. And outside of Blazing Saddles, there wasn't really, it was very slim pickings, but that hadn't really affected me growing up, not in ways that I felt were discernible. It wasn't until a producer named David Permit approached me with the idea of telling some kind of televisual, filmic, we hadn't really decided version of this story that I went, I cannot believe I knew nothing of this guy, given just how extraordinary his life was, given how beloved this genre is, given the amount of time that has passed in cinematic history, that there surely could have been, should have been opportunities to tell his story. So I was in quite a state of shock, and it's where my kind of a obsession with telling the story began. I sort of felt a little bit indignant that it hadn't been done before.
What surprised you most about his story and just his life?
I think the sheer arc of his story, to go from being enslaved to deputized as a deputy U.S. Marshal and being given legal um, agency and permission to arrest the likes of folk who had literally, within very recent living memory, enslaved you, i.e., white people. A lot of them very disgruntled, I should say, um, uh, Confederate, ex-Confederate soldiers who had become outlaws, who were very upset with the Civil War happening at all, let alone the results of it, let alone the fact that Black people were free. And now you're going to add salt to the wound by having, Black men deputized to be able to enforce the law, which sometimes meant arresting white people. So that was something that struck me as what a 180 to deal with as a character, and what were the trust levels in a country, in a justice system, in a government that very recently had deemed it permissible that you could be enslaved and now deems it permissible that you can be deputized. That must just be so confusing, such a head spinning scenario. So that was some of where I just knew the drama lay.
You mentioned an affinity for the Western genre. What are some of your favorites that you grew up on?
Oh gosh, well, more recently, Unforgiven, I just think is a transcendent movie. True Grit, both the original and the newer one, I think are extraordinary pieces of work. And then I love films that sort of have a Western vibe. Again, a more recent one is Hell or High Water, that I just thought, it's kind of a Western without being a Western necessarily. So, it's films like that that not only have the tropes, but also have the humanizing factor while having the big sky of it all. But in all honesty, it was the Lone Ranger. It was the TV shows, the Gunsmokes and things like that, where you just go from a procedural point of view, just getting to jump on that horse and be a purveyor of justice, was something that really caught my imagination as a child. And that was one of the things as well, when the theory that the Lone Ranger was actually inspired by Bass Reeves was just completely mind-blowing when, putting on that mask and of course I didn't have a white horse, but my mum's broom was my white horse. And so that was kind of an amazing theory to know was very pervasive out there. And then to, have a remote possibility of playing the actual, what some deem to be the origin story, so to speak, of where the Lone Ranger came from.
What has it been like working with Taylor Sheridan?
Well, I'm incredibly grateful to what Taylor created in the form of Yellowstone and that whole ecosystem that in many ways in a business and an industry that is so reliant, I would argue, unduly so, on comps. One of the reasons it took so long in my world, I mean, there are others who tried and didn't quite succeed in getting the Bass Reeves story told, but my journey was an 8-year journey from 2014 up until the point we actually got to the green light, so to speak. And, I just, the resistance to it was comps. And what people weren't really admitting to is we don't have a big Black Western, how they perceive it. I don't perceive Bass Reeves as a Black Western, but the perception is you're centering a Black man, you're centering a Black family. Like, what do you compare it to? It's an expensive genre, so it's a bit of a risk. The reality is when I first went out with the show, every single cabler or studio or network we went to said, we're not doing this because no one's making Westerns. And then 2 years later, we went out again, and the excuse was, we're not doing this because everyone's making Westerns. So it just became clear that you just don't want to make this Western. And because Taylor had had such success with Yellowstone and then 1883, it became hard to posit that excuse. And, his name means a lot in that space. It kind of gives a studio a feeling that there's going to be an audience for it. So I didn't work with Taylor on the scripts or he wasn't a director. He wasn't an on-the-ground producer, so to speak. I would say his primary contribution was building a platform on which Bass Reeves could stand.
You were also in another show this past season about law enforcement from a radically different perspective, and that's Silo. How does it feel having these two projects, sort of at least in every conversation at the same time?
Yeah, I joke it's my sheriff season. I did actually worry because I was wearing a badge as Holston Becker in Silo, thinking, gosh, I'm about to go and wear another badge. I'm someone who tries to resist being typecast. But I guess one is very much in the world of sci-fi and the other very much in the Old West, so to speak. So maybe my concerns were unfounded. But yeah, what's so wonderful with both Silo and Bass Reeves is the audience reception to both. I've been doing this a while now, and it is almost impossible to have two things that are meaningful to you, two characters that have real meat on the bone that you both enjoyed doing. The audience really embraced it. Critically, they've done well as well, and they continue to be part of the conversation, so to speak. So, you know, it's been a dream scenario really with these two sheriffs, and the highlight for me on Silo was getting to work with Rashida Jones, who I just think is so brilliant, and I loved seeing her do something a bit more dramatic. You know, she's obviously a genius comedic actress, but you know, that was a real highlight for me, as was playing in the same sandbox as Morton Tildum, who I think is a wonderful director. And also just, you know, with both Bass Reeves and Silo I didn't produce. Bass Reeves, I was very intentional with this producerially, but both of them very much center very relatable, familial circumstances. In Silo, you know, a couple who desperately want to have a child is kind of the core of what myself and Rashida bring to that narrative. And then in Bass Reeves, it's a man and woman who love each other, have a family, and who desperately are trying to find their way back to each other constantly, given how dangerous his job is. And I think that, you know, even though you have sci-fi and the Western, these big and beloved genres, at the end of the day, I think we really gravitate towards the relatability of the characters, and both those characters and both those shows had that in spades.
We also spoke late last year for a short that you were in, The After, that was nominated for an Oscar. That's its own sort of storytelling because it's even shorter than one TV episode. How do you feel about that format? And is that the kind of thing you'd like to do again sometime soon?
Well, working with Miss Anne Harriman is certainly something I'd like to do again. You know, I don't think, well, for me anyway, I don't go looking for shorts. Shorts are kind of an oddity, right? Because, you know, who do you sell them to? Who watches shorts? You know, but thankfully Netflix, who quite rightly saw the potential and the talent in Miss Anne, for whom this was his first film, and then you know, Miss Anne DM'd me, you know, out of the blue during the pandemic, and I'd been looking at his amazing photography, and it just made sense to me that he was now going to start committing his voice to the moving image. But again, a little bit like Silo and Bass Reeves, I could not have anticipated the reaction to the short, let alone Oscar-nominated short, and just how affected people have been by a short that gives people the license to talk about their own grief journey, to look at something that even, thankfully, most people will not have experienced what my character experiences in the short. But coming out of the pandemic, coming out of just the state of the world right now, I think a lot of people can relate to the rug being pulled out of them, whether literally or proverbially, in terms of the world we currently live in. And so, yeah, it's connected with people in such an incredible way, and I couldn't be more proud of it if I tried.
We do love awards here at Awards Buzz, so I'm curious if there's any performance or show you've seen recently that feels particularly awards worthy to you.
Well, you know, I was just completely blown away by Sandra Hüller in this last season in relation to her work in both Anatomy of a Fall and Zone of Interest. You know, I am very keyed in when it comes to performances that capture my imagination. But the fact that I had watched Anatomy of a Fall, and then it wasn't until I was deep into Zone of Interest I realized it was the same actress. That I can't remember when that last happened to me, because I have quite a good brain for faces. So that was very indicative of just how wonderful her performance was in both. I would say of in the last year or two, you know, those two performances by the same person is something I can't quite shake out of my mind.
Well, before I let you go, I know you have a show coming up that I feel like, based on its title alone, is probably going to be substantially different than the series we've talked about here, and that's Government Cheese. Is there anything you can preview about the show? I know it's still a ways out.
Yeah, we're actually on our final block of shooting right now. It's going to be 10 episodes. It's a half-hour comedy, as I hope the title suggests. And yeah, it's incredibly different to any of the projects we are currently talking about. A lot more lighthearted, which I like to mix things up. But again, centers a Black family, but is set in the late '60s, and my character's he's just come out of prison for petty crime and is trying to stick to the righteous path, as he calls it, having had a kind of quasi-religious experience in prison, and he just can't quite do it. And so a lot of the show is him wrestling with God over following what should be the righteous path, and consistently failing in doing that very thing.
Well, I definitely look forward to seeing that. It seems like it's something different from what you've done, and it's always a pleasure to get to speak with you and unpack all of your work. So thank you so much for your time, David.
Thanks, Abe. Always great to speak to you too.